back to VUDivulged. I'm Aja Chambers.
I'm Blake Gardner.
I'm Anthony Polkowski.
And we're going to kind of shift topics today from some of the other things we've been talking about. It is important for us as a major to discuss some of the different ways that you can use our degree. I know some of you will never get this degree. Some of you are just parents that really want to watch their kids. Hi, Mom.
Yeah, and my mom.
And Grandma.
And Grandma.
But it's important that we discuss these so that if we have students that are really interested and want to know more about some of the different things that you can do with our degree, they can just come to our podcast, which you can see on our link tree on Facebook now. You can come to this episode and you want to be involved in FEMA, great. We have a whole thing on what FEMA is, what it offers you, and hopefully some jobs at the end.
And if you think about it, when you get further into discussion, there are actually roles in FEMA and other agencies where maybe a Homeland degree is not, the suited degree, right? Maybe you have a more, I don't know what to say, like, specialized degree. Homeland's such a broad topic, but if you have a more specialized degree, there's still roles for you in the federal government.
So what do you guys know about FEMA?
So I know that with being the Federal Emergency Management Agency, they look at an area and they go, all right, if a disaster of X magnitude happens here, what resources do we have in the immediate area that we can allocate to that area and, help recover after a disaster?
Well, I know that it falls under the Department of Homeland Security, one of the 22 agencies within it, and that it was created during the Carter administration. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Created during that. And basically what you said, it's just, it works with state and local levels. It's, falls under the federal government, and basically just kind of helps them prepare, respond, and to recover from disasters. Also help mitigate such disasters as well.
Yep, so you both are pretty close, pretty right, I would say, actually. So we're going to go way, way back to 1803, the Congressional Act of 1803, the first legislative act of federal disaster relief in U.S. history, followed a devastating fire in Portsmouth, New Hampshire in 1802. There was a large area of destruction right on the seaport, and it threatened a lot of commerce and commercial packaging of goods at the time. So the U.S. Congress provided relief to affected Portsmouth merchants by suspending bond payments for several months. And that's the first one, the first legislative act where the federal government has stepped in after a disaster and been like, we're going to help you. And then we're going to flash way forward. So for a very long time, we were in a period called the Cold War. What do you know about the Cold War?
It was essentially a massive arms race between mainly America and Russia, and the reason they call it the Cold War is because America and Russia, although we did fight a lot of proxy wars against each other, I don't really know how to actively engage with one another on a larger scale. So even though it was a war, it was considered cold because not a whole lot was actually happening. That and a lot of spying.
Yep. So you're totally right. So in 1979, President Jimmy Carter, as you said, established FEMA in Executive Order 12127, and it was effective as of April 1st of that year. And what this did was it signed in FEMA. FEMA was the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Generally at that time, it was for consequence management of nuclear war. That's what the thought process was. Because everything at that time wasn't focused on a natural disaster. It wasn't focused on a technological hazard. It was all nuclear war. And after that, Executive Order 12148 was signed in on July 20th, so just a couple months later of the same year, and Carter gave the agency the dual mission of emergency management and civil defense. We all know what emergency management is. We all know how that works. Civil defense is a little different. So civil defense was understanding, if there's a threat of a nuclear attack, how do we recover and respond from this? So, like, in the time, what needs to be up and running? And after we get those massive, the big key critical infrastructure up and running, how do we recover? How do we recover everything else? The quality of life, the loss in population, the loss of goods sold, things like that. That was a big one.
Was that more focused on the civilians, the civil defense?
It was. Generally, the thought process was still protecting American assets. Across the nation,
Like manpower and critical infrastructure. But as you stated, clearly not from a natural disaster. They were focused mainly on a nuclear fallout. Then the more common natural disasters.
Absolutely. And this was the case for another 10 years. And it was just solely nuclear disasters and terrorist events. So in 1988, there was an amended act called the Stafford Act that was renamed after Robert T. Stafford, who was a senator in Vermont, I believe. Is that correct? So he's a senator in Vermont, and his huge thing is all about disaster relief. And what this does is it gives FEMA this clear, direct look at what they're supposed to do. So it stops covering just nuclear war. It stops covering just terror attacks. It's all things. It's every hazard, every natural disaster. All of it is a main focus now. It puts FEMA into a straight line to go. Anything that affects American civilians on a national level, you are in charge of the consequences. You are in charge of helping them respond to it, if you can, and recover from it afterwards. And once we've gotten through the response and recover, we're going to talk about prevention from next time and mitigation tactics. And that's kind of what the Stafford Act is.
So it just kind of gave it the framework.
Yeah. And then there was still a lot of focus coming into it with how FEMA looked at things. It was still more focused on terrorism than natural disasters. And there's a little bit later that we'll get into that. But obviously, what's the biggest terror attack that's ever happened in the U.S.?
9/11.
9/11. 9/11 happens. Right after 9/11, we create what department?
Homeland Security.
Homeland Security, which has how many agencies?
22.
22 wonderful agencies, including the Federal Protective Service and FEMA.
Well, actually, that's a quick thing to bring up. FEMA and all these other agencies have been around for a good bit. But when they created the Department of Homeland Security, that kind of just brought them all under one roof. Like one agency kind of controlled all of them.
It's
Like,
a unified command.
Yeah, and then I believe immediately it was, wasn't it 16 or 18 agencies right off the gate, but then over time that as needs arose, they kept introducing more and more. But as of now, there is 22 agencies.
So in 2002, President Bush signed in the Homeland Security Act, and this leading to the creation of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, which we've already talked about, and then it united FEMA and 21 other organizations over the next couple of years. And at that point, when you have such a large terror attack, what is everything focused on in the Department of Homeland Security?
War.
Protecting the homeland
War
from
and
terrorism.
terrorism.
So up until right then, everything had kind of worked out where it was like you're going to respond to natural disasters too, but terror attacks, and now it's just terror attacks. This is the biggest one that's ever happened. We need to focus on this now. Right up until August of 2005. In August of 2005, we had one of our most historic hurricanes in Mississippi, Hurricane Katrina, and it was one of the largest scale devastation hurricanes that has ever hit the U.S. And it displaced families to all 50 states, and it resulted in billions in losses in infrastructure and the economy. It was huge. I mean, huge. Hey, raise your hand if you've never heard about Hurricane Katrina. Exactly. So, and we were what? 2, 3, maybe 1?
2005. Yeah, I was 2 or 3.
Yeah.
Depending on when
I was definitely 2. August of 2005.
Yeah, then I was 2.
So right after this, we're like, wow, natural disasters are really bad, and we need to figure out a way to recover from these better because we've been solely focused on terror attacks.
And they can be more harmful and cause more damage than these terrorist attacks.
Because they just displace so many people from large floods and everything like that.
The city of New Orleans got hit hard. I remember my sophomore high school trip down to New Orleans. They actually took us to the spot where the levees failed, and it's like there's like power plants here. There's grocery stores. There are people that work here, and all of that just got wiped out. So not only did people lose their lives, well now their infrastructure took a massive hit. Like the power's gone. People aren't working, which means the economy is going to tank, and it's going to tank a little bit more because now all the money is going into rebuilding the city instead of producing. It's like you're building the factory right now. You're not producing anything out of it. You have to fix it first.
And they put thousands of people in the Superdome where the Saints play. Thousands of people sleeping.
I remember
on cots.
seeing footage of that, of just the thousands of people using it.
One thing I've always heard about Katrina was just how the response of the government and FEMA absolutely just failed. That's what you always kind of hear about what happened.
I also hear that before Hurricane Katrina, they did take, terrorism attacks very seriously, because of 9/11. But FEMA like people didn't really take the FEMA side like seriously, for lack of a better term. They were like, I mean, yeah, guys, we understand it, but it's not, like you said, it's like we're kind of dealing with terrorism at the moment, and natural disaster ain't that big of a deal. Well, then Hurricane Katrina hit Mississippi and Louisiana.
I would consider personally Hurricane Katrina to be one of the most impactful parts of the history of FEMA, because out of it came the Post-Katrina Emergency Management Reform Act of 2006. And essentially what this act did was it established FEMA as a very distinct agency within the Department of Homeland Security. So it defined its primary mission, and then the FEMA administrator was the principal advisor to the president and the Homeland Security Council for all matters relating to emergency management. So major disasters, terrorism attacks, all of those things that have consequence managements to it fall to the FEMA administrator. Our current FEMA administrator, does anybody know who that is?
Off the top of my head.
Criswell?
Deanne Criswell, correct. So now we have a distinct organization, a very, very driven organization that has just seen some massive devastations. And from then on out, they have worked on a very professional model, which works on those horizontal relationships between local county EMAs, the Indiana Department of Homeland Security, all of these people working together in something like that. So when we look at that kind of model, what we do need to see, and one of the big things to note, is all disasters start at the local level. Everything starts local. Once the local has reached the end of their resources and capabilities, they will reach out to the state. The state is capable of declaring an emergency. Once they declare an emergency, they can submit a request to FEMA. FEMA will review the request, accept the request for aid, and come and help them respond and recover it as they can. The only person that is capable of declaring a disaster, though, is the president, or whoever is in the president's succession when the president is not capable of doing so. And I think that's a really important thing to note, because that professional model, as opposed to the old traditional model, which was very vertically focused, the military and the federal government are the be-all, do-all. They say it all. They say it, we do it. They tell us to jump, we ask how high. And now we're focused on, well, our fire incident command over here is dealing with the fires on this end of the city due to this massive windstorm or hurricane. We're dealing with the floods over here with our rescue team, our dive team, and the person in charge of that is Chad, and Chad is our dive team lead.
You're turning it from standard SOPs or standard operating procedures, which are very strict, very rigid, and in some situations they can help, right? But the problem with SOPs is, you can take every scenario that's ever happened, write it in a book, memorize the book, and on day one you're going to encounter something that is not in that book. But if you stray away from your standard operating procedures, there is huge liability risk, and everybody's just going to say you should have followed your SOP.
Standard operating procedures leave no room for adaptability.
But with the the horizontal, it's much more flexible. Instead, they're more. It's like that scene from Pirates of the Caribbean. It's more guidelines than rules nowadays, right? It's
the National Response Framework. So
it's a framework, not a.
It's a backbone to work off of. It is not a strict, rigid, when this happens, you do this, when this happens, you do this, because not everything's on there. They may say when this building starts to collapse, you need to get out of the way, but they won't tell you if the building behind you is going to collapse, you need to get out of the way of that one too. So you just backed up and you look up and you go, there's another building collapsing on me. That's not in the procedures. That's the point, is that we opened it up to be more able to adapt.
Yeah. And you allowed the command structure to be, not as, it's not like the captain's making all the decisions, right? And then he's reporting to, it's, I believe the term is called decentralized command, where it's like you have the right? You have your one person who's...
Your incident commander.
Incident commander who is in charge of, managing the whole thing. But he also gives the people under him the authority to do what they need to do, right? You're using your scuba example. He's probably not constantly managing the scuba divers saying, well, here's how you need to plan your dive, here's how you're doing this. He looks at them and says, I need you over here, but you take care of it how you need to take care of it, because you're the dive expert. You have 20 years experience search and rescue diving, and I have
they have policies and guidelines that they follow. However, those policies and guidelines are always make sure you're checking your oxygen tank. Rule number 1, always don't become victim number 2.
Mm-hmm.
So those rules, but not you need to dive down exactly this many feet. You need to go this angle into this person. It's just a way to work it, not how you work it.
Exactly. It's because if you get to the point where everybody has to ask for permission to do things, you're slowing things down because eventually someone's going to go, well, it's not in my power to authorize that, so we have to go higher up the chain, which then means the person at the very top, the incident commander, is going to have to approve every single decision that anybody makes.
Mm-hmm.
And that takes time, and that just slows everything down. One example, with Katrina, that the reason it was so... it hit America so hard was, we've dealt with natural disasters, but since there wasn't really a plan, everybody was, sending food, clothes, water, which is nice. It's nice seeing that the American, people were willing to help, but the problem was there was so much food that a lot of it actually began to rot, in the trucks. And well, now we have to deal with the rotting food because we can't really just throw it out right now because, city... the trash trucks really aren't our priority at the moment.
They're not making the runs right now. The levee's broke.
Yeah. So nowadays you'll actually see that the incident commanders or even the governors of states will actually request things, right? Instead of saying, just send us whatever you can. It's, hey, we would actually, it's the colder months, we could really use some extra clothes. Well, then people are going to send clothes, right? And a lot of people say send money instead of supplies, because then they can actually buy what they need.
Sizing, everything.
It's with money you can get everything, right? America being capitalism, with it, you can anything with a little money you can get. So it's send financial aid. That's not saying if you have water, go ahead and send it, but.
So, 2 other things to note that are just really important to FEMA's history, and then we'll just kind of go into some other stuff into FEMA. Specifically, I want to wrap up at the end with some jobs that are open in the area in FEMA. 2 of the other acts that are really important are the Sandy Recovery Reform Act. And it says federal capabilities were tested once again in 2012 when Hurricane Sandy affected the entire East Coast. The storm effects were extensive, leaving millions without power. I remember seeing clips of this, and it was just immense destruction. Destroyed hundreds of thousands of homes, billions of dollars in damages. And then Congress passed the Sandy Recovery Reform Act, and this kind of streamlines the recovery of public infrastructure, and then it allows federally recognized tribes to directly request a presidential declaration for a disaster, because the East Coast has a lot of those tribal organizations, and obviously there's more and more as you get farther westward, but even then that was an issue where those federally recognized tribes weren't able to ask for the help that they needed, so it allowed them to request a presidential declaration of a disaster regardless of whether the state declared it as an emergency and submitted a request. The other one I want to talk about is the Disaster Recovery Reform Act of 2018. 2017, the nation faced this huge amount of just terrible weather phenomena. There were wildfires across the country, and the Atlantic hurricane season was insane. And the rapid succession of these disasters had emergency management constantly on the back foot, trying to get ahead of this, trying to figure out how to respond better. All of what the Disaster Recovery Reform Act was about preventing and mitigating. So it had states coming up with the expanded authority of the state was coming up with ways to prevent and mitigate disasters and putting out legislation that highlights federal government's commitment to increasing investments in mitigation, states' investments in mitigation, whatever is going to stop these from happening so badly, whether that's we need to spend money on a wildfire helicopter. That was one of the things, is that federal funding needed to come in so that they could get wildfire helicopters into some of these states that were never really used to dealing with them, but they had spread from across the West and were just burning thousands of miles away.
And, I think that's another challenge that a lot of people, it's hard to convince people of. It's like, well, it's never happened here before. I'm like, okay, but if it does, right, the chances aren't zero. So yes, the chances of you saying some states didn't really deal with wildfires of that scale. It's like, all right, but when it happens, what are you going to do about it? It's like,
well, I mean, that's how it is for everything. Katrina, the levees, they could have built better levees. But like a hurricane this past this size has never happened before. So let's save money here and put money elsewhere. Well, when that hurricane came by, stronger than what the levees could take, well, guess what? That happened. They're not going to make the same mistake again, but usually that's how it occurs. When it happens, we learn from it. We wish it wouldn't be the case. Like, you just do the best you can. Like, be ready for all, but you can't always prepare for every single scenario. Especially, like I said, sometimes you get blindsided by things that will occur.
Like a lot of terrorist attacks. Terrorist attacks come, a lot of times they came out of nowhere. But unfortunately, a lot of them there are pre-warning signs, but they didn't know to look for those at the time. And then 9/11 came out of nowhere for a lot of American public, and like the city of New York, like the hospitals, and just the New York Fire Department, they lost 343 firefighters in just a few hours, right? So now, not only do you have to deal with the effects of the towers falling, but now the entire city has 350 less firefighters to go on medical calls, to go on fires. So now you have to help recover, right, the city, not just because fix up the area ground zero, but now they're going to need help in the meantime dealing with the standard call volume, because not only did those 343 firefighters lose their lives, but that's also experience and the training that they also lost. So now you have to take the time and train and hire and go through to replenish
I mean, that's why the unified command of the Department of Homeland Security is necessary. So everyone works together. Everyone's better at a certain sector. If you need aid, you can easily get it.
And that's why standards are so important. And I'm in a hazmat material class right now, and it's ruled, it's under the state, and everything is strict. Like, even when we take our tests, like we can't just, it's not like every other classroom where we can just take it in the classroom. I have to actually go to the LRC, into a testing center, and your professor's not even supposed to be in the building when you take the test. And everyone gets mad. It's like, well, why are the standards so strict? Well, it's because you need to make sure that whoever you're training to those standards understands those standards, because that way, whether we take someone from Indiana or someone from Iowa, right, they have the same training, right, and although they've never met each other before and they've never talked with one another, they still have the same training, they have the same guidelines, and they can understand each other's jargon, so to speak.
So it's all very important. But you brought up jobs that were currently open. What kind of are we seeing exactly? Because I never really looked into FEMA exactly what all it kind of offers.
Are the jobs only federal management, or do you think there's more specialty jobs?
So there are a lot of different types of jobs, and they hire in all different types of career fields. Veterans and military spouses, they hire people from local organizations. One of the big things to note, though, is that with the Federal Emergency Management Agency, there aren't a lot of jobs that just sit locally. Now, I'm sure there are remote jobs. I don't have any of those pulled up right now currently, but a lot of the jobs will require you to be not exactly where you are. So some of the jobs here, just kind of finish up, as I said, we'll finish up with some of the career ideas. So Deputy Chief Security Officer for the Federal Emergency Management Agency works out of Washington, and their roles and responsibilities are is in conjunction with the CSO and assists in the oversight and coordination of security efforts across the agency. And essentially what that means is it's an agency-wide job, and it works directly in DC. So you're working directly with the higher-ups at FEMA. They offer jobs like program analysts, supervisory management and program analysts. That's a lot of the jobs you'll see on here are program analysts. One of the big ones that I thought was really weird to me was attorney advisor. So they're hiring attorneys, they're hiring public affairs specialists, environmental protection specialists, for those that might be interested that have come from our conservation law side.
Wildfires, that's the fire science degree right there.
Historic preservation specialist, community planners, supervisory emergency managements, recovery, response, and mitigation are 3 different types of jobs. So you can work in the recovery side, the response side, or the mitigation side. And all of these jobs are in different places. There's Kansas City, Missouri, Bothell, Washington, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, DC, Maryland, a lot on the East Coast, you'll see that. supervisory civil engineer for mitigation, Chicago, Illinois, which is closer than the other ones. Atlanta, Georgia. There's multiple locations looking for materials handlers. Just these different kind of jobs that you wouldn't expect to have in an emergency management agency that are really important. Chief of staff in Kansas City, Missouri. That is a very, very high level job for where that is. But I think that talking about those to kind of end on that note is something that's really important, because we could talk about FEMA all day, but if people don't know what kind of jobs they have, it's
And
not
just
gonna
shows,
be the same.
it also just goes to show, like, you know, like how in depth this disaster recovery thing, like, it's a lot more simple than, we'll just call 3 firefighters over from the other state and, you know, 3 from that county, and we'll be good. There's a lot more to it than just send out a request for aid and we'll send whatever we have. It's a lot more in depth than that.
So I think that about rounds out our episode for today. We really appreciate you guys watching, and we're so glad that we got to sit here and talk to you about FEMA and how our degree fits into that and what that can offer you. So thanks so much.
Well, actually, we also plan to talk about more of these different agencies within Poland.
Yes.
You're right.
I mean, I think,
Yeah.
like I said, there's
Moving
22. Well, there's 21 now we haven't talked about yet. So if you guys want to see more of these agencies, we'll be sure to bring you guys in, tell you more about it. Especially things that this degree will go into, and other degrees could go into all these different agencies within the federal government. Well, see you next time, guys.